Okay, imagine this. An entire economic union spanning, what, 3 continents, hundreds of millions of people. And it operates for decades without standard market prices or even, like, proper exchange rates. Sounds almost impossible.
I think that's stretched the imagination a bit.
Well, today we're tearing open the files on just such a system. We're diving deep into Comecon, that's C-O-M-E-C-O-N, officially the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. You can think of it as the Eastern Bloc's ambitious economic counterpoint during the Cold War.
Yeah, and our mission today, really, is to understand not just what Comecon was, but why it operated the way it did. What were its goals? What were the surprising challenges it faced? And ultimately, what's its unique legacy, especially when you compare it to something like the EEC, the European Economic Community?
Exactly. We'll look at its very foundation, how it sort of evolved or maybe didn't evolve under different Soviet leaders, and we'll uncover some genuinely fascinating details about how it tried, and let's be honest, often struggled, to manage trade and production across this huge membership. You'll basically get a shortcut to understanding a crucial and I think often misunderstood piece of 20th century history. And this deep dive, it draws from quite extensive research, right? Historical analyses, economic studies you've looked into.
That's right. A lot of digging into the archives and economic data.
Okay, so let's start this journey, this Cold War economic experiment. What was Comecon, fundamentally?
Well, at its heart, Comecon was an economic organization. It was definitely under Soviet leadership, bringing together the Eastern Bloc countries, plus some other socialist states later on. It was around from 1949 right up until 1991.
And the name Comecon, it applied broadly, not just the central body.
Yeah, often people used Comecon to refer to pretty much all the multilateral economic stuff happening between the members, not just the official council's work.
Okay. And you mentioned it was a counterpoint. So it was basically the East's answer to the Marshall Plan and the OEC in the West, that organization that became the OECD.
Precisely. It was the Eastern Bloc's direct response, explicitly set up as an alternative economic system.
So what was driving Stalin to set this up? Was it just about countering the West?
That was a huge part of it, absolutely. Stalin wanted to strengthen ties with those smaller Central European states, which were getting cut off from their old markets. Yeah. But the real turning point, the moment of truth, you could call it, was July 1947.
What happened then?
Well, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, they actually showed some interest in Marshall aid. But the conditions attached things like convertible currency, market economies that meant closer ties to the West.
Which Stalin couldn't accept.
Exactly. Totally unacceptable. So he ordered them, their communist governments, to pull out of the Paris conference discussing the aid. And that, right there, marks this huge ideological and economic split in post-war Europe.
But weren't his motives a bit murky? You hear different things.
Oh, definitely. Some historians call his motives inscrutable, maybe more negative than positive, meaning he might have been more worried about keeping other powers out of his buffer states rather than genuinely wanting deep economic integration within them.
So defense more than offense in a way.
Possibly. And things like GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, with its non-discrimination principle.
Yeah.
That just didn't fit with the idea of socialist solidarity. Plus, there was a practical issue.
Which was?
How do you trade between centrally planned economies?
Yeah.
You need some way to coordinate prices. Otherwise, you've got the state as the only seller facing the state as the only buyer. A monopolist versus a monopsonist.
Yeah.
Without a market, setting prices becomes, well, arbitrary. You need coordination.
Okay, so coordination needed, political motives. When did it officially kick off, and who were the first members?
It was formally established in Moscow, January 5th to 8th, 1949, announced publicly a bit later, January 25th. The founding group was the Soviet Union, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, and Romania.
Albania and East Germany joined soon after.
Right. Albania joined within a month, East Germany in 1950. And there's this interesting detail from recent Romanian research.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
Elena Dragomir suggests Romania might have played a key role in proposing it. Their leader, Gheorghe Dej, apparently wrote to Stalin in late 1948, pushing for it, hoping to get better access to industrial equipment through trade.
Wow, Romania. That's surprising. You usually just think of Soviet dominance from the start. What does that tell us?
It hints maybe at an early phase where smaller members still thought they could shape it for mutual benefit, but that didn't really last.
How so? What was the initial direction?
Initially, the idea was coordination of national economic plans. But crucially, Comecon itself had no coercive power. Decisions needed everyone to agree unanimous ratification, and then each country had to implement it themselves.
Sounds a bit toothless.
It was. And then Stalin stepped in around mid-1950. He basically put the brakes on. The Soviet Union was shifting towards autarky, trying to be self-sufficient, and Stalin preferred just meddling directly through embassies, not these constitutional bodies.
So Comecon almost died right there.
Pretty much. Its scope got officially limited to just practical questions of facilitating trade. Very narrow.
But even in that early, stifled period, some weird policies emerged, like this Sophia Principle.
Ah, yes, the Sophia Principle. August 1949. It was quite radical. It essentially dismantled intellectual property rights within the bloc.
How did that work?
Technologies developed in one country were made available to all the others for basically just a nominal fee, just covering the paperwork costs.
Who did that benefit?
Well, obviously the less industrialized countries, including, interestingly, the Soviet Union itself, which lagged technologically in many areas compared to, say, East Germany or Czechoslovakia. They were the ones who lost out, seeing their innovations shared for peanuts.
So a policy that looks cooperative on the surface?
Actually undermined the incentive to innovate in the long run. It kind of baked in stagnation right from the start. That pattern of prioritizing political goals or short-term fixes over long-term economic health, that would really persist.
Okay, so Stalin's grip nearly choked Comecon, and policies like the Sophia Principle created underlying problems. But he dies in '53. Did Comecon get a second wind? Did things change?
They did try. After Stalin's death, Comecon, which was, barely functioning, started to get looked at again. Countries began cautiously moving away from strict autarky and started talking about complementary specialties.
Right. This is where it gets interesting. As you said, they talked about specialization, like what, Soviet oil for Polish ships or something, coordinating the big 5-year plans.
Exactly that kind of thing.
Yep.
Trading raw materials for manufactured goods, trying to align those massive national plans. It was a more ambitious vision for integration.
It wasn't smooth sailing.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Almost immediately, you had major setbacks. The Polish protests, the Hungarian uprising in 1956, those events caused huge disruptions. Governments had to focus on just regaining stability and legitimacy. And the Soviet 5-year plan for 56-60 basically got thrown out the window.
Still, they kept trying.
Yes, the efforts continued. They introduced this thing called the convertible ruble. We can talk more about what convertible really meant later.
Right.
They revised the specialization plans, and they even adopted a new charter in 1959. Interestingly, it was modeled, at least structurally, on the Treaty of Rome from 1957, the one that founded the EEC.
So trying to emulate the West's success in a way.
Maybe hoping to achieve similar integration, but through socialist planning, of course.
Yeah.
But did that transnational planning actually take hold? Not really.
Khrushchev pushed for it, though. Didn't he call for, like, a single planning body in '62?
He did, a common single planning organ. But it meant strong resistance. Romania, which was becoming increasingly nationalistic under Gheorghe and later Ceausescu, was particularly forceful in rejecting it. They absolutely refused to be designated as primarily agricultural specialists.
People wanted to industrialize.
Precisely. Among the Central and Eastern European countries, only Bulgaria really went along readily with the assigned role Moscow envisioned for it.
So the takeaway is?
The key insight here is that even the mighty Soviet Union couldn't just impose deep economic integration. National interests, sovereignty, those were powerful counterforces.
Did any integration happen then?
There was some progress, yes. Limited progress, mainly in sectors like petroleum pipelines, electricity grids connecting the power systems, and some scientific and technical cooperation. They founded the International Bank for Economic Cooperation in 1963, that convertible ruble bank.
But overall?
Overall, Comecon countries actually ended up increasing their trade with the West more than they did with each other during this period, which tells you something of where the real economic dynamism was.
That really speaks volumes. Okay, let's move into the Brezhnev era, post-67 or so. Did cooperation manage to become real integration then?
Well, they certainly changed the language. But first, a key structural change happened in 1967. Remember how decisions needed unanimity? That was a major bottleneck.
Right, so what changed?
They adopted something called the interested party principle. This basically meant a country could opt out of a specific project or initiative if it wasn't interested, without blocking the others who were interested from going ahead.
Trying to get around the veto problem.
Exactly. It was partly seen as a way to let Romania, for example, pursue its more independent economic course, without having to leave Comecon altogether. They could just step aside from things they didn't like.
And then the language changed too.
Yes. After 1969, the official talk shifted from cooperation to integration. The stated goal became more ambitious, equalizing the differences and relative scarcities of goods and services across the bloc, trying to level the playing field, supposedly.
But those underlying challenges you mentioned, central planning, the diversity, the sheer size of the Soviet Union, they didn't just disappear, did they?
Not at all. Integration remained constantly frustrated by national central planning systems that just didn't mesh well. The membership was also getting more diverse. Mongolia had joined earlier. Cuba joined in 1972, Vietnam later.
Which added even more complexity.
Huge complexity. You had highly industrialized nations like East Germany and Czechoslovakia, alongside largely agrarian or underdeveloped economies like Mongolia or Vietnam. And looming over it all was what analysts called the overwhelming asymmetry with the Soviet superstate.
Give us the numbers again on that.
By the early 80s, the USSR accounted for something like 88% of Comecon's total territory, and around 60% of its population. That imbalance shaped everything. There were attempts to create cross-national industrial associations trying to bypass some of the national planning issues, but they often just became new layers of bureaucracy.
Were there any bright spots economically during the Brezhnev years? Any successes?
Well, one significant development in the 70s was tapping into those huge Soviet oil and gas fields.
Ah, the energy resources.
Exactly. The East European members benefited massively from cheap Soviet energy supplies. Prices were set within Comecon based on sort of rolling averages of past world prices, so they adjusted very slowly.
Meaning when the 1973 oil crisis hit the West.
Comecon countries were largely insulated from it, at least initially. They continued to get relatively cheap fuel, which fueled pretty strong growth in the mid-70s for many of them.
Was that a deliberate subsidy from Moscow, or just how the system worked?
That's debated. Some saw it as an implicit political subsidy to keep allies happy. Others argued it was just an unintended consequence of the slow price mechanism and the sheer abundance of Soviet resources. Probably a bit of both.
And what about Cuba? They weren't exactly energy rich.
No, Cuba was a special case. As an underdeveloped member, it got highly favorable terms, particularly the famous sugar for oil swaps. Within the socialist ideology, this was justified as counteracting unequal exchange, the idea that market prices inherently disadvantage poorer nations.
Okay. What about détente, that period of easing Cold War tensions? Did opening up to the West help Comecon economy?
It definitely brought opportunities.
Yeah.
Western loans, investment, technology transfer, it flowed into the East.
But did it work?
Often, not very well. Any projects using Western tech ran into trouble. There's the famous example in Poland with the Ursus tractor factory using licensed Massey Ferguson technology. It faced huge problems and delays. Capital wasn't always used effectively.
And the downside?
The big downside was debt. As the TOT started to fade in the late 70s, most Comecon countries found themselves heavily indebted to Western banks and governments. Then came the recession of 1979 and 1983, which hit Comecon hard too. Romania and Poland in particular saw major drops in living standards. Most never really recovered fully before 1989.
This whole period seems to highlight how central planning really struggled with efficiency and innovation.
Absolutely, it raises big questions.
Like that story about the Czechoslovak train. Can you tell us that one?
Right. So in the 1970s, engineers in Czechoslovakia designed a really advanced, lightweight, modern underground train for the Prague Metro. State-of-the-art for its time.
Sounds great.
It was. But
Okay.
Technica, the Comecon plan dictated that the trains for Prague should come from the Soviet Union. And the Soviet trains were older technology, heavier, less reliable, more expensive to run.
So Czechoslovakia's own better design was just ignored.
Pretty much. Using the Soviet trains guaranteed production quotas and profits for the Soviet factory involved. It was a classic case of the central plan and probably Soviet interests overriding local innovation and efficiency.
Wow. Wow. So the system actively discouraged better solutions sometimes, but were there counterexamples? Did specialization ever work where a smaller country provided something for the whole bloc, even the USSR?
Yes, definitely. It wasn't all one-way traffic or bad decisions. Czechoslovak trams, for instance, the iconic Tatra T3 model, became the standard tram used across almost all Comecon countries, including the Soviet Union.
Okay, that's interesting.
And Czechoslovak jet trainers, like the L-29 Delfin, were the standard basic trainer aircraft for Warsaw Pact Air Forces for years. Poland, meanwhile, produced light helicopters based on a Soviet Me-2 design, but Poland became the main manufacturer for the whole bloc.
So sometimes a country did become the designated specialist.
Yes, but the catch was often that other countries were then discouraged, sometimes quite directly, from developing competing designs, even if they thought they could do better for their own specific needs. It reinforced dependency on the designated producer.
Okay, so we've seen these internal contradictions, the economic pressures building up, the debt crisis. How did this whole structure finally unravel?
Well, the final act really starts with Gorbachev coming to power in the Soviet Union in 1985, and his policies of perestroika restructuring and glasnost openness.
Did he try to reform Comecon too?
Yes, there was a big push with the Comprehensive Program for Scientific and Technical Progress, launched in 1985. The idea was to sort of jumpstart innovation and cooperation, create a more modern, efficient scientific and technical base for the whole bloc. It was basically the last major effort to put the Comecon economies onto a sounder footing.
And how did that go?
It largely failed. The program demanded huge investments, which further strained the already struggling Soviet economy. It actually made shortages worse in some areas, and the other East European members. They grew increasingly resentful about having to contribute their scarce capital to projects that often seemed designed primarily to benefit the Soviet Union.
The cracks were really showing then.
Big time. The writing was on the wall. By June 1988, a significant shift occurred. Individual Comecon countries were formally allowed to negotiate trade agreements directly with the European community. That was a major symbolic break.
And then Gorbachev's Sinatra Doctrine.
Exactly. The idea that each country could do it their way, that the Soviet Union wouldn't intervene militarily to prop up unpopular communist regimes anymore, that effectively signaled the end was near for the old bloc system, including Comecon.
So the actual revolutions of 1989 across Eastern Europe, they didn't formally kill Comecon, but they made its demise inevitable.
That's a good way to put it. The political ground shifted completely. A Comecon meeting held in Prague in March 1990 was pretty much just going through the motions. The real nail in the coffin came on January 1st, 1991.
What happened then?
That's when the member countries officially shifted all their mutual trade onto a hard currency market price basis. Overnight, the old system of bartering, negotiated quotas, and the transferable ruble was gone.
And the impact?
It caused a massive immediate collapse in trade between the former members. Their economies were suddenly exposed to world market prices, and many of their goods just weren't competitive. It was a huge economic shock on top of the political changes.
So when did they officially pull the plug?
The final Comecon Council session was held in Budapest on June 28, 1991. They formally agreed to dissolve the organization within 90 days. And just a few months after that, in December 1991, the Soviet Union itself ceased to exist.
A truly definitive end to an era. What happened to the former members afterwards? Did they all just rush to join Western clubs?
For the most part, yes. The direction was overwhelmingly westward, especially for the European members. East Germany had the unique path of joining the EU automatically through German reunification in 1990.
Right.
Then you had the big EU enlargements, the Baltic states, Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, Slovenia, all joined in 2004. Bulgaria and Romania followed in 2007, Croatia in 2013. Many also joined the OECD, the Club of Developed Market Economies.
But not everyone went that route. What about Russia and the non-European members?
Russia, as the Soviet Union's successor state, tried to form new groupings.
Right.
There's the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS, which had limited success. More recently, things like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, with China, and the Eurasian Economic Union, EAEU. For the Asian members, Vietnam and Laos eventually joined ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So a much more diverse geopolitical landscape emerged. Now, if we really want to understand Comecon's significance, connecting it back, comparing it directly with its Western rival, the EEC, that's incredibly revealing.
Yeah, let's do that. They both aimed for economic integration, you said, but the paths were just fundamentally different. What were those core contrasts? Lay them out for us.
Okay, well, first, structure, size, balance. Completely different worlds. The EEC, back in the 80s, covered about 270 million people, all within Europe. Its focus pretty clearly on maximizing profits, economic efficiency, driven by market forces.
And crucially, it was supranational.
Yes, that's a key point.
Yeah.
The EEC institutions could adopt decisions like removing tariffs, setting standards that were binding on member states. It had real authority, and economic activity was mostly driven by companies and individuals responding to market signals.
Okay, now contrast that with Comecon.
Comecon was geographically vast, 450 million people across 10 countries on 3 continents by its peak. It linked highly industrialized states like East Germany with very underdeveloped countries like Mongolia or Vietnam.
Yeah.
Huge economic
In
disparities.
the Soviet dominance we talked about.
Overwhelming. Remember, the USSR had around 90% of the land and energy resources, 70% of the population, 65% of the total national income of all members combined. The general pattern was the Soviet Union supplying raw materials and energy, and the Central East Europeans supplying finished goods, machinery.
Okay, so vastly different scale and composition. What about how decisions were made? You mentioned Comecon lacked that supranational power.
Right. It never had supranational authority. Its recommendations, even after the interested party rule, needed buy-in from the countries involved. They didn't apply to countries that opted out. And an interested party could still effectively block things through negotiation or foot-dragging.
So decisions came from the top down.
Essentially, yes. Driven by planners, political directives, largely ignoring market signals or private initiative because there wasn't much of either. The interested party principle was really just a workaround for the lack of real binding authority, an attempt to stop Romania mainly from paralyzing the whole thing. It highlighted the weakness, not strength.
Compared to the EEC enforcing rules.
Exactly. The EEC could force members to comply, which drove genuine integration. Comecon could only suggest or persuade unless Moscow applied direct political pressure.
And trade. How did state monopolies compare to market-driven trade?
Worlds apart. In Comecon, foreign trade was almost entirely a state monopoly in each country. This created huge barriers, bureaucratic hurdles, lack of information flow, opportunities for corruption. Producers had little incentive or ability to really adapt to what customers in other Comecon countries actually needed or wanted.
And you often hear that the best stuff was kept for domestic consumption.
There was definitely strong political pressure to do that, keep the highest quality goods at home. And unlike the EEC, where you could argue that growing cross-border trade between private companies helped reduce national rivalries over time, the state-to-state nature of trade often reinforced national rivalries, bargaining over quotas, prices, quality. It could become quite adversarial. And the data shows intra-Comecon trade, apart from that crucial Soviet oil, was actually declining as a share of members' total trade from the 50s onwards, the opposite of the EEC experience.
So fundamentally, they weren't even trying to achieve the same kind of integration.
That's really the bottom line.
Yep.
You could describe Comecon as functioning more like an international protection system. Its main goals were often about coordinating plans, providing bilateral aid, like the oil for sugar deals, maintaining political alignment within the bloc rather than optimizing production across borders.
Protection and planning versus
Versus the EEC, which was much more an international trade system, focused on efficiency, market allocation, competition, consumer choice, driven by the logic of comparative advantage and profit, however imperfectly. One was about control from the center, the other about decentralized market forces.
Wow. This deep dive, it really lays bare the huge, maybe insurmountable challenges of trying to run economies on that scale without proper market signals. Comecon stands as this powerful historical case study of how central planning, especially across borders, really struggled to adapt, to innovate, and ultimately just to keep working.
It really does. And it leaves us with a pretty big question to chew on, something for you, the listener, to consider. Looking back at Comecon versus the EEC, how much do the core philosophical beliefs underpinning an economic system, the ideology, if you like, shape whether international integration efforts succeed or fail? And how much does that still apply today, even in our very different globalized world?